Welcome to the 7th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee meeting. Could I remind everyone in the public gallery to please turn any electronic devices to silent, as they may interfere with the work of the committee. Item 1 is a declaration of interests, and I would invite Michelle Ballantyne and Alison Harris to declare any relevant interests.
Want me to go first?
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. I need to declare that I am a major shareholder and director of a manufacturing company, and also the managing trustee of a large estate that was left to the benefit of the people.
Alison.
Morning, thank you. I would like to declare that I am a practising chartered accountant, and you can refer to my register of interests.
Okay, thank you very much. Item 2 is the committee's choice of convener. The Parliament has agreed that only members of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party are eligible for nomination as convener of this committee. I understand that Michelle Ballantyne is the party's nominee for this post. Do we agree to choose Michelle Ballantyne as our new convener? Agreed. Thank you. Congratulations, Michelle, and I'll hand over the chair to you, and good luck.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're quite tight on time today, so first of all, can I welcome you all and make sure that we take item 5 and 6 in private. Does everybody agree that we do that?
Yeah.
Thank you. Right, today we're considering the Protection of Workers, Retail and Age-Restricted Goods and Services Scotland Bill. This is a private member's bill, and we're taking evidence on the bill at stage 1. We have 3 panels today, so we are going to be quite tight for time, so I would ask that all members and witnesses try and keep their questions and answers quite tight, and so that we can get through everything efficiently. So first of all, can I welcome Gillian Maudsley, Policy Executive from the Law Society of Scotland, and Ian Thompson, Superintendent, Safer Communities, Police Scotland. Good morning. So we have a series of questions from our members, and can I start please with Richard Lyle?
Thank you, Convener. Can I remind everybody that I am a member of the cross-party group for convenience stores. The committee is aware of concerns about high levels of violence and abuse directed at retail workers, and that situation may be worsening. From police experience, what is the scale of the problem, and is it getting worse? I think my question is directed to Mr. Thompson.
Okay, thank you. Is it getting worse? It's difficult to say from a reported point of view. One of the issues that we have around about understanding the extent of the problem is that our processes for recording crime do not facilitate an intuitive way of breaking down the information to identify the specifics around about retail crime workers. From a generic or a general point of view, we have seen obviously a decrease in violent crime over a number of years, and there is, over the last year or so, there has been a kind of flatlining of that. It's absolutely evident that is the case. However, I think what we do within the police organisation is that we recognise the significant impact. It's something that affects every local community across Scotland. It's something we recognise as an absolute priority, and we continue to work not just within the legislative framework, but also, more importantly, with the partnership, significance of partners with a view to try and prevent that crime and make a sustainable solution in that regard.
There's a perception that the justice system does not always take the abuse of retail workers seriously. No, I think the point is just made. The reporting of incidents will not lead to prompt or rigorous police action. Cases won't be prosecuted, and if they are, will result in light sentences. Would you like to comment? And maybe my question is directed to Gillian Maudsley.
I think that's quite a general statement, and if we can perhaps break it down, I think it's important to look at the criminal justice system as a whole. There are different stages in the process, as you're familiar, And I think what would be useful is to ascertain exactly at what stage of the process there is a failure to take what is clearly a problem and is unacceptable, which is violence towards workers. Now, I have obviously in my evidence referred to the different stages, and I'm aware of your time constraints, Convener. I'm happy to go through that. But there was one particular aspect that you've talked about. You talked about light sentences, which, if you like, is the conclusion of the process. I didn't find in my work any suggestion that where such offences were being convicted, that there was light sentencing. And that's a particular aspect that could be addressed if that were a problem, because clearly there are rights of appeal with regard to sentence. And there's also the Scottish Sentencing Council with a rolling guidelines where that felt to be appropriate. So that's only one section. If there is just one point I'd pick up from what Mr. Thompson said about statistics. The government keeps statistics, official statistics on crime. And I think the difficulty here is that there's a whole generality of offences that occur in retail or maybe towards retail workers. And I think that better specification or availability of information would be better able to inform what we outlined as to, is it a failure to report? Is it a failure by the police? Is it a failure by Crown Office? Is it a failure by the courts? Does that help?
Yes, that's fine.
Jackie Bailey.
I wonder whether I could ask Ian Thompson this, because I'm curious to know what factors the police take into account when deciding what action to take when there's an incident of abuse against a retail worker.
Okay, it'll depend very much on the circumstances, and I mean, the point that I would like to make is that we treat violent crime, antisocial behaviour and disorder as a priority across Scotland, whether that be a retail worker or any other member of the public. We absolutely recognise the significant role that retail workers play within the community. It's really, really important. When we receive a call regarding somebody being physically assaulted or abused, we will make sure we send the police to that. We have a process of assessing exactly what the threat and the risk is to the individual based on the circumstances. Police officers will attend and they will carry out the appropriate investigation, which primarily is speaking to the individual, the victim themselves, getting a note of the circumstances, identifying whether or not a crime has been committed, or if there's other activity that needs to be taken, even if a crime hasn't been committed, and with a view to then, if there's sufficient evidence, and that can come from many places. CCTV can come from interviewing of witnesses, own observations of the police officers themselves, depending on the person that's still at locus, etc. And then appropriate information will then, if there's sufficient information to arrest, they'll be arrested, subsequently charged, and that investigation carries all the way through to then a report to the Procurator Fiscal.
My experience, though, locally is that it stops after the police have attended and no further action is taken. I mean, is that common, or is that just peculiar to my area?
I suppose it's difficult to comment without the individual circumstances. There's not a police officer who will go with a policy to say that we won't take further action on this. It will be based on the individual circumstances, and if there's evidence to substantiate further activity and action and crime, that will be taken forward. We've got a duty to keep people safe, and it's a duty to report the evidence that is there in relation to when the crimes are committed, including recording it.
Okay. Can I ask Gillian Maudsley the next question? In terms of enforcement, do you anticipate any practical or legal difficulties based on the way the proposed offence and aggravation are framed?
I think the aggravation is an interesting question. I think the bill maybe has two. It has an offence, it also has an aggravation. The problem, I think, partly with an aggravation, I said, was that you could argue that one source of evidence may not be sufficient if the aggravation is a fundamental part of the crime, and there might need to be corroboration. So that's one I can see of a potential difficulty of how did the incident spark off. So that's one potential difficulty. The other thing with regard to aggravations is that we're used to dealing with aggravations in relation to protected characteristics, and I think before this Parliament, within a matter of weeks, is going to be a very interesting bill that may actually provide some guidance as to how you might deal with aggravations, and that, of course, is the hate crime bill that we're expecting imminently, and I refer to. And I think that might be an opportunity when looking at the type of aggravation that you're framing. That might be an opportunity, depending how that bill, and I have no idea how that bill's been set out, that might provide the opportunity or channel to highlight this. I don't know, but that's a suggestion. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much.
Can I just ask a point of clarification there, Mr. Thompson? When you say, obviously, it's based on what has occurred, and Gillian Maudsley commented on corroboration being an issue. In your experience, does lack of corroboration cause things not to be taken forward?
Well, if we don't have corroboration, it's very difficult to substantiate the crime. But the corroboration can come from a number of areas, as I was saying, and it depends on individual circumstances. CCTV is valuable. So I think it's important to realise that, or understand that, the sufficiency of evidence to charge does not need to be to the same level. I don't want to be speaking on behalf of a lawyer, but the sufficiency of evidence to charge does not need to be sufficient enough to then get a conviction. So it means that the corroboration can give us sufficient evidence of confirmation of crime and indicate that there is an accused person identified. So, yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Vera. The submission from Police Scotland suggests that non-punitive measures might be sometimes appropriate when dealing with young people who've got engaged in abusive behaviour. Can you maybe expand a wee bit on that and when it might be considered appropriate?
Yeah, this is something that I think is really important. It's the challenge between how you prevent crime against the sort of the impact, the potential impact on the people that are either affected by the crime or committing the crime itself. I'm aware from experience, and if we look over the last number of years around about the work and violence reduction, that it is evident that if we look at the enforcement activity alone, it is not a successful approach to prevent crime. It has a really important element to it, but it needs to be part of a wider plan. And that wider plan is to understand the cause of the crime, the cause and what causes people to act in that way, and to build on that primary prevention element, which is to understand what causes it, try and intervene before the crime actually happens. When a crime takes place, as we've seen in other areas, is that, again, the criminalisation of children is not always the best outcome in relation to the life chances of that individual and their ability to then carry on their life and not turn back to offending crime. So my belief is that there's more value in having an opportunity, whether that be referral to the appropriate resources, around about, I'm trying to think, so basically non-punitive, referral to third sectors, etc., and people that can actually assist with offending behaviour with a view to trying to change the behaviour, as opposed to put them in front of a court in a punitive measure.
I'm just thinking of the evidence that you gave to Jackie Bailey when she was talking about, what you decide to, deciding what action taken in relation to a specific incident. How would your response change if this bill came into effect? You were talking quite clearly about that you did respond to calls from retailers who had a problem, that you did intervene, you did try and take evidence, you had problems with corroboration sometimes, but how would this change if this bill came in?
In relation to the actual incident itself, I don't think there would be a significant change in how we went about our business, because ultimately, obviously depends on the fact that I think there's an additional bit about hinder and obstruct, which is not covered by other legislation, as I understand. That would change, certainly, because of an additional offence there, etc. But if the circumstances are such which there's criminal legislation of a crime or offence at this point in time, it would be a crime or offence, so it would effectively be the same approach it would take.
So regardless, you would follow the same police procedures to try and determine whether an offence had taken place. Absolutely. And whether action needed to be taken. Yeah. It wouldn't change at all.
No, absolutely.
Just continuing on that, you mentioned obstructing and hindering, and obviously that's a big issue in this particular bill, and it's not currently criminal. How could you give an example from your perspective as to when an incident of obstruction or hindrance might take place? How would you define it? It's a slightly unfair question, but I'll ask it just the same.
Yeah, I think that's one of the points I would make, is that if this is going to become legislation, I think it needs to be very, very clear exactly what that definition is. I think from an operational police officer's point of view, lack of clarity, is a word I can say, lack of clarity is not a good situation when the police are going there to attend, and I think there needs to be clear exactly what would constitute an offence. It's from a training point of view all the way through to operational practical application.
Do you think this new offence, if it came into place, do you think it should be subject to criminal sanctions, obstruction and hindrance?
I have concerns that looking at what you're trying to achieve from the outcome and the end-to-end process of that, because ultimately the outcome is to make it a safer environment for retail workers, to prevent crime happening in the first place. From what I've read, it feels as if it is lowering the threshold of criminality. And again, from experience, with it being age-related product, you're then introducing the element that it may involve offenders who are children or young people. And
are you thinking specifically about sale of cigarettes and alcohol?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there is a risk that the end does not justify the means, or that the outcome isn't achieved in relation, but there is a risk that it actually criminalises children and young people and making an adverse impact on their life choices. And that is not to say that one person is more important than the other. It comes back to what the outcome is, and the outcome that we want to achieve is ultimately, it's deplorable that anybody should be working in the retail trade and feel that they can be the victim and live in fear of doing that. It is not acceptable, and it must be eradicated quite simply, and it should be prevented, and we'll do everything in our power to do that. It's just that's what the outcome is, and going through a criminal process to ultimately get to court, I'm not sure if that will ultimately prevent crime from taking place.
Dean Lockhart wanted to come in.
Thank you, Convener. I had a follow-up question for Mr Thompson. It would help the committee, certainly help me, to understand what Police Scotland see in practice when you get a call in relation to abusive retail sector workers. Are there typical circumstances or one or two scenarios you commonly see when you're called out, whether it's involving drugs or cigarettes or alcohol? Is there a kind of scenario you can paint for us in terms of what you see in practice?
I can't say it's typical. I'm sure you'll understand, the superintendent, I'm now no longer turning up at the shops and dealing with these incidents. However, I've got enough awareness of what happens from both my own experience and speaking to officers. There is not an atypical example, because it is very, very dependent on the individual circumstances. And it depends on the behaviour of the individual that is causing the alarm or causing the violent crime. It is evident, and we are aware that there's a whole range of things that can happen, from people standing, being abusive. There is a hate crime element of it that can sometimes come into it. There can be people who have been physically assaulted, of course, and that exists as well. So I suppose what's important for us as a policing point of view is understanding what the powers that are available to allow us to deal with those circumstances, which ultimately protects everybody concerned at the point of where there's that risk of threat or harm to the individual.
Thank you.
Okay. Can I move to Willie Coffey?
Thanks very much, Convener. It's probably a question more for Gillian. We have a submission, Gillian, from the Prosecution Service, which argues that current laws allow us to respond appropriately at the moment to reports of abusive behaviour against retail workers. What's your view on this in general? Do we need the bill, basically?
I think the difficulty with the bill is that it's got excellent motivation. We are aware that there's a problem. It's being reported. There's lots of evidence. I think the problem is that there is a number of offences that can be used for prosecution. So I do agree with the Crown Office submission that there is a range of offences that can be used. What we felt would be very useful, and we identified in our evidence, is if various scenarios could be identified which are currently not being prosecuted, then these could be analysed to consider where there were gaps in the current legislation. And if there are gaps in the current legislation that can be demonstrated, then there may well be need for legislation, whether under this bill, under whether the hate crime bill or any other legislation. So I think it's that gap that I'm having difficulty with in identifying that this is a scenario. I mean, for instance, an example was given to me this morning of, for instance, a retail worker being spat at. Now, that is totally unacceptable, and that would be prosecuted as an assault under current legislation. But the problem is that somebody has to report that to my colleague here for him with sufficient admissible evidence, corroborated evidence, for that then to go to Crown Office to be prosecuted in the public interest. And it may be that gap in kind of corroboration, or that gap of awareness, that is then causing the problem here. But I'm certainly open to scenarios being presented and being asked, can that currently be prosecuted under current legislation?
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. And can I declare that I'm the convener of the cross-party group in independent convenience stores? Just carrying on the conversation we've had just now about whether there's a gap in the legislation. A couple of things. One, British Retail Consortium survey suggested that there had been a 100% increase in incidents of violence with retail workers. The USDAW suggested that 70% of shop workers in Scotland experienced verbal abuse, 42% were threatened by customers, and each day 18 workers were assaulted. If there is not a gap in the legislation, why are we seeing an increase in problems with attacks on shop workers? I mean, what's the problem? Is it under-reporting by the individuals? Or what is the situation that's causing this problem where we're seeing crime generally in Scotland dropping, yet we're seeing an increase in retail workers having problems, whether it's harassment or obstruction, or whether it's physical or abuse that they're actually facing? What's the issue? What's the real issue that we need to tackle?
Well, I would only start off by saying, obviously, for the criminal justice system to be engaged, it needs to be reported. I do not doubt the figures that you're quoting, that there clearly is a rise. The first thing is a greater specification of exactly what's meant. I mean, violence is obviously unacceptable. Mr. Thompson's referred to that, and we would totally agree. So the question really is, what sort of conduct are the people who these figures representing? So, and once you've identified the sort of conduct, then you can ascertain that that conduct is indeed criminal. We've talked about hindering, and I would completely echo what Mr. Thompson has said. You need clarity of the law. So is the law clear? I would have thought the law had a range of offences that can be used for a majority of the offences, but as I keep saying, I'm more than open to a scenario being presented and saying, no, there's a gap, that's not prosecution. So I think there probably is under-reporting. That's speculation by me. There's maybe a lack of understanding.
Just on that point about under-reporting, do you have any figures that suggest how many cases are reported, how many cases are decided that a crime has actually occurred and how many actually arrive in court?
That is exactly the figures I was alluding to earlier that would be exceptionally useful. The trouble is with the official statistics on that kind of information. Firstly, you're talking of different organisations. You're talking Police Scotland's reporting. You're talking of Crown Office, Scottish Court Service. They all treat things slightly differently, and I know that from my previous professional experience. I think the difficulty is that you don't have figures that are saying, well, this violent incident occurred in a retail sector. What is being recorded is an assault that's then convicted. It so happens it occurred in a shop, and lots of convictions will relate to perhaps a shop or premises, such as you're concerned with here today. I think if there was a better evidence base. I do not doubt the information that the retail organisations are giving about rise in problems for their staff that is potentially criminal. But I think if there was a better evidence base across the whole of the Scottish criminal justice system, and to an extent I alluded to this when we talked about question 8, if we could get it clearer, then we might have a better understanding at which point in the system there is a failure arising. But I would tend to think that there may well be underreporting. Now, Mr Thompson's alluded to a number of potential reasons for that. Could be people they don't think anything's going to happen, so they don't report. They don't realise it's a crime. They think it's the norm for the job. So there's all these kind of underlying things that we're aware of, not just in relation to this type of offending, but offending in general. People having confidence, employers supporting them. Oh, you don't want to report that because I'm going to lose a witness going to court, and look at the justice system, it's going to take forever to get a result, or the result is not going to come back to the staff, or the staff still need to deal with the same people coming into the same shops doing the same thing, where actually, how are you going to stop them? Because a fine's not going to stop them. Community payback may or may not. That's maybe an illustration of why I think there's a lot of problems coming from source that there are things that could be done to understand it better.
Right. And I mean, what you're basically suggesting is there has to be some kind of culture change. And, you know, do you agree, or what is your view on whether the introducing this bill would actually send a clear message that abusive behaviour shouldn't be tolerated in society? You know, if nothing else, would that not improve the fear of going to your work from retail workers, that they might face abuse on a daily basis?
I would, as I said, if there are gaps and the legislation is addressing the gaps, I would agree with you. My concern with the bill is that legislation or criminal prosecution, as Mr Thompson has said, tends to be, I don't mean the last resort. Clearly people need to be empowered to know that stuff that they're suffering is criminal and that should be prosecuted. My feeling is that better awareness, perhaps of the raft of measures, better information, perhaps better support from employers, better information, better maybe some kind of directed campaign. We talked a little bit about what had been done for the NHS in England. I wonder if that could be the front line of making an attempt at much better joint working across all the criminal justice partners, the solicitors and also the retail sector, to try and get a campaign. You've had some very, very successful public awareness campaigns, you know, to do with speeding and other items. Whether something like that might be, if you like, the first, I'm not meaning it's the first, because obviously lots of things going on, but something that the government really gets behind, similar to what was done in England for the NHS, might be a first stage. Having said that, I think that runs in parallel to what we were talking about before, which is the need for much better understanding of perhaps underreporting, and also through what part of the system it is failing to support retail workers.
Okay. Mr Thompson, you got any views on that?
Yeah, I'd add, in addition to having clarity of what the understanding of the information that is available and the events that take place, and the question you'd asked around about what is leading to people's behaviours, that's the crux of the matter for me, because that's the opportunity, when you understand that, to then build in the preventative measures to divert people away from carrying out that behaviour in the first place, and then it means the offence doesn't happen. That's what success is for me. So I would absolutely echo colleague is saying there, is that having understanding, but there's lessons as well in relation to some of the work that we've done recently, is that it's relying on just the police data is at a point of failure, and there is underreporting, so you don't get the full picture through the police data. The partnership data is where you get the full data. So then the surveys and how people are feeling, that is a rich environment of information to help us understand that. And we currently work with partners to try and help understand those issues, to try and identify at the point, at the earliest opportunity to intervene, be proactive, that stops the person from offending in the first place.
Okay.
So there's one other thing I just wanted to say as well, sorry.
Sorry.
We are absolutely committed to working with a lot of the retail trade, and we do across all the areas across Scotland at a local level, national level through the Scottish Business Resilience Centre as well, and we do a lot of engagement around about education and understanding around about what the rights of the individual are that work, how to keep themselves safe, the encouragement management, the layout of shops, etc. There's a lot of proactivity work that goes in there because we see that as really valuable to actually reducing the impact and the potential of poor behaviour.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you. Just very quickly picking up on that. One of the things that obviously was introduced a few years ago was the early and effective intervention to divert from prosecution 16, 17-year-olds. Now, if this law was in place, one of the indicators would be that it would make people feel safe, and they would feel, shop workers would feel better that prosecutions had taken place, etc. But obviously diversion from prosecution would cut right across that in many cases. Would you see that as an issue if it was in place?
No, I think the diversion from prosecution, again, it's about the outcome. The diversion from prosecution is there for a reason, is to try and prevent the criminalisation of people, to give them the best opportunity of life chances, which then can set them on a path where they can go on and not become criminal people and causing harm in the community. So I think it would enhance the effect that if legislation is brought in place which allows the intervention of individuals in relation to their offending behaviour, or is in place currently, that's really, really important in relation to what helping people recognise that it's unacceptable to put up with that behaviour. But ultimately, what you want is that individual that's committed that offence not to commit it again. So
if this legislation was in place, it would allow the police to be called for an offence to be charged, but a diversion to prosecution could then take place on a sort of 2 or 3 strikes and you're out.
So that's further down the line, yeah. But there's legislation in place at the moment that allows the police to be called and deal with that.
Right. So you don't feel it's necessary. Okay, thank you. Andy Whiteman.
Thanks, Convener. Gillian Musley, in your Law Society's evidence, you talk about, picking up some of the points that Gordon MacDonald was talking about, you talk about the need for research on whether cases are being reported and not progressed, where they're being reported, have issues arisen about the need for corroboration, etc. Is it your position to be clear that you don't believe this bill is necessary until such research shows there's a need?
I think there is a difficulty with the bill. I think the ethos of the bill is very well motivated. The difficulty I find is that trying to find where there are the gaps at the moment. If the gaps exist, the scenarios would demonstrate where there is a failure. I mean, I think there are lots of things happening here, and it's a complicated landscape. So I think if you can find the gaps in the absence of criminal offences, or if there's behaviour that's not being prosecuted that should be criminal, then absolutely the bill would be necessary. But I think there's an absence of that data, which comes back to some of the points I've made earlier.
Okay, and it's been suggested that this bill, if it were to become law, although most of the offences it creates are already covered by existing legislation, would send a signal, send a message, and to retail workers in particular, to show that we care about them and we care about the fact that they are suffering abuse. I mean, as a matter of sort of public policy in terms of the law, is the law there to send messages?
I think the law is a very useful role for sending messages, and obviously that's why we have legislation that decriminalise offences or criminalise offences. So I think the law is important in that respect. I think, as Mr Thompson said, there are other things that can happen before you get to, if you like, the ultimate of legislation. And I think we're all aware of campaigns that have been used, I've already referred to them, that perhaps talk about the existing law. We're not talking in a lacuna here. There is law that is available, certainly to prosecute most of the sort of offences that are being referred to. As far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of any gaps. So I think there is a need for them for there to be more awareness and there needs to be encouragement and support given. So I think there's a lot that can be done without necessarily new legislation. Do I think that needs a specific campaign? I would certainly be very much encouraging something to be done. I don't think the position that's being reported by the retail organisations and all the figures is something that we should sit here and say, that's okay then, something's not working. But I think there are solutions before necessarily new legislation. But I do think that things like the hate crime bill that are coming through are major pieces of legislation for the Scottish Parliament. And I think they may provide some other opportunities as well, which we ourselves don't know at the moment. But yes, I do think that something should happen. Whether it's legislation or not, I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks very much. Can I move on to the proposal to create a new criminal offence of obstructing and hindering retail workers? Comparisons have been made with existing legislation on emergency workers, which makes this a criminal offence. What are your views on this comparison? Is it a valid comparison?
Mr. Thompson? Or?
Yeah, I'll go with that one. Thanks. Again, I'll start by saying I recognise the importance of what retail workers do. The legislation that exists around about restricting access of goods which can cause harm amongst the community to age-restricted products, etc., is a really, really important part of keeping people safe. There's no getting away from it. It is, I mean, it's the community working together ultimately, along with the police, to try and do that. The comparison direct with emergency workers, I'm a wee bit uncomfortable with, just for the fact that the powers and the duty that I have as a police constable are enshrined in law, and primarily are for the purposes of carrying out prevention and protection of life. I understand why we have the offence of obstructing a police officer or other emergency workers, because the potential consequences, I'm not saying the consequences are all the time, but the potential consequences are that they become life-threatening. There's also the addition is that it is equally important because of the powers that have been conferred to me as a police constable, which are very, very different in relation to shop workers. And again, it's the outcome of what we're trying to achieve there for me, because if that offence exists, it's what the value will be in relation to the prevention of crime. It's not going to come with it additional power for an individual member of the retail trade to act in a particular way. Obviously, I'm at the locus. If somebody obstructs and hinders me, I can arrest them. So I have a power that supports that. That then turning into a criminal act, and then it being through the court system or the criminal justice system, if ultimately the outcome is that the person is not going to be prosecuted in court or to be given a custodial sentence, because I understand there's a presumption under 12 months for not to be a custodial sentence. It kind of loads the activity at the point of where the call and police are involved, etc. Now, if it's decided by government and the legislators that that is a right thing to do, absolutely, we'll fully support that, and we will attend and carry out the law that's what we're here to do. It's just that, again, it's looking at what the outcome is and what we're trying to achieve as to whether or not that's going to be the best way to do it.
Okay. Do you have anything to add, Ms. Mosley, to that question? Or, because you make reference to this.
I think I support much of what Mr. Thompson says. I think retail workers who are carrying out these assessments are effectively complying with legal requirements. So there is a similarity, but obviously the police have certain powers which they don't have. I would just draw a similarity to people like the Health and Safety Executive and also the Trading Standards, who have similar powers of inspection and would not have this kind of protection that is being envisaged. So that's point one. Point two is, I think the difficulty with words like obstruction and hindering, both you and I will have a concept if we were to define what that meant. The trouble is that you're almost leaving it to be defined by case law or reported decisions in due course to add clarity to what can be quite an unclear concept. What that then does is not create clarity of the law at the outset. And if you are considering making criminal offences, the one thing that we support is absolute clarity. So I know if I do A, it's criminal, and that's, if you like, the ultimate sanction. So I think that's a difficulty with the words obstruction and hindering as well.
So obstructing and hindering, I may be wrong, but my understanding is they're not defined in the 2005 Emergency Workers Act.
No.
But is it your position that that's more easily discernible because police constables and firefighters and ambulance workers are clearly on a mission, as it were, and so it's more easily...
I probably have been a little bit broad perhaps in what I said, because obstruction definitely is one that's used in legislation. We've got a common understanding. It's perhaps hinder that is a lesser. When I hinder you, I can hinder you in lots of ways. I can hinder you by not answering your questions. And I suppose it's hinder which seems to extend it, but also the point you're making where the police very much are arriving in a scene and got certain powers, and if I refuse to give certain information, that's an offence, etc., etc. So I think it's not quite the same situation, and that's one of the difficulties of maybe widening it to include something like hinder, where it could just be me being a bit stroppy, and again, criminalising conduct that shouldn't be criminal, and leaving it perhaps to case law, to perhaps having to clarify whether this is really, and the courts, whether this is really criminal or not. So I have some concerns about that particular aspect, yes.
And I presume there is statistics on the use of the powers under the 2005 Emergency Workers Act.
There should be statistics, I would have thought, in the
we'll know how many
and
prosecutions have been and all the rest of it. And follow that up. That's fine, thanks. So I just want to talk about the proposed statutory aggravation that's already been referred to.
Just before you move on with that, I think Mr. Thompson wanted to come in.
There's a further point I was going to make as well. Sorry, it was round about the obstruction and the hindering. I know that some of the information that was supplied beforehand was a concern around about when it comes to the age restriction around about in the sale of alcohol, which is particularly challenging for some retail workers. And it was just to highlight as well and make aware that there is a bit of legislation that sits there which has been designed under the Licence in Scotland Act 2005, which where somebody refused to leave premises for that sell alcohol, there is effectively a power for a police officer or other person, appropriate person, to come along, who's been empowered to come along and ask that person to leave. And if the person does not leave, they can be ultimately commits an offence and they can be removed by force. So there is an element there of still there is legislation. Now, I know that means that a police officer needs to turn up and deal with that. But it's there, which means if the person is refusing to leave and it's stopping the people or the retail worker to continue going about their business and to serve other people, there is some legislative opportunity there that can happen.
Okay, thanks very much. So moving on to the statutory aggravation, I mean, do you agree that given that statutory age restrictions on products, for example, they've been designed in the public interest and therefore retail workers are carrying out a duty that is advancing the public interest? Do you both agree with that? Yeah. Do you see merit in the proposed statutory aggravation? I ask because the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service tell us that in the prosecution guidance there is already grounds for aggravation if an offence is committed in the course of employment. Now, is this something that needs more research again, or on the face of it, is prosecution guidance sufficient there, or do you think that this statutory aggravation in primary law would help?
The reason I said that aggravation was interesting because I equated it with the hate crime bill. I would say that already, as far as prosecution is concerned, the circumstances of the incident will be taken into account, exactly as Crown Office have said, whether they prosecute in the public interest. So arguably, aggravation isn't required. Similarly, I would certainly say that any sheriff would take into account exactly how something arose. I suppose the only point we were making here was that we very much saw the fact that an employee is having, on, if you like, a duty to ask for something, we could see how that was a trigger. My concern is that the circumstances are probably already taken account of, and I had a concern about the need for corroboration of that aspect, how the incident started, and that I could see as a difficulty, whereas the incident itself, the whole broad picture of the abuse, no matter almost how it occurred, may well be prosecuted anyway, and within court, as the circumstances come out, it might be one source of evidence saying, well, this started when I asked for the identification. The sheriff would be very much able at that point to say, well, I'm sentencing here, and I note that this incident all arose out of the retail worker exercising their absolute right to ask for an age. Now, maybe it's that point that could be emphasised in sentencing without necessarily the need for an aggravation.
The problem there, I suppose, is you're relying on the sort of discretion of individual sheriffs to think about that, as it were, whereas in these circumstances, the prosecution, if there were a statutory aggravation, the prosecution could clearly draw attention to that, ask for that to be considered, and it would have to be considered. You couldn't avoid that question.
I think that's probably a fair comment in respect that if you're wanting to make it sure, then it needs to both be coming through from the police report into the Crown Office report into the court for it to be taken account of, that the reason that this incident actually occurred was exactly as you've outlined, because somebody was asked doing their job for identification and this kicked off an incident. I'd like to think that happened. I'm not saying it does.
Okay, thank you.
Richard Lyle just wanted to come in.
Mr Thompson, there's been various changes to the Licences Act over the last number of years. You can't buy alcohol before 10 AM and you certainly can't buy it after 10 PM. Do you think the change, the 10 AM change, has made any difference to the assaults on shop workers?
I don't know. This is an easy answer. A difficult answer to give.
It's amazing how many people who go into a shop, my local shop, at 9 o'clock in the morning and want to buy a can of beer and have to be told, sorry, you can't because it's now, you know, and they don't want to wait about for an hour. You know, it would be interesting to know if there are any information in regard to that.
I don't have information.
I'll certainly be asking the next panel the same question.
Right, no bother. But I think I think it makes sense that the fact that of the period of time that for which you can't buy alcohol.
Do you think we should, as a policeman, do you think we should relax the licensing laws?
The issue here. I think we'll move on. Alison Harris.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. The written submission from the Law Society suggests that the problem of violence against retail workers requires a multifaceted approach. So I would really like you to ask, what does that involve? Could you expand for me, please?
I think I probably expanded on it at the beginning. I think it's, you know, there clearly is a problem that is being outlined, and it's not whatever the solution is, it's not working. By multifaceted, I think it starts with the person who's receiving the abuse. They have to be empowered to be able to report it. They need the support of their employer, so the complete employment is engaged. There's also a role for the police in the community, the person who's perpetrating or the people who are offending. So is that the schools, the local schools? Is there a particular target? So that's about local policing. We then move on, once assuming it has been reported, to a better understanding, clearly, which I see as the role partly of the legal profession generally, is to make sure people actually understand what the law is and the reasons for either prosecution or failure to prosecute because there's insufficient evidence. Throughout the Crown Office, then clearly that's the prosecution side that proceeds as any other criminal case, but they have a role obviously in communicating public interest prosecution. And then with regard to the cases in court, they go through court. Clearly, sheriffs should be encouraged to give reasoning where they do for sentencing. And I think there's a role at looking at the sentencing, exactly as Mr Thompson's talked about, because these people offending are low-level offending. I'm not suggesting it's not serious, but it's low-level offending which is unlikely, given the presumption against short sentences, to result in a custodial sentence. So they're not being taken out of the picture. So this comes back to some of the alternatives to prosecution, mediation, or not quite mediation, but some of the alternatives, which is about community approach. So I would like to think that by multifaceted, I meant looking at it both as a community in your local constituency. Are there particular hotspots? Looking at it bigger picture for Scotland, which is obviously your duty here. That's what I meant by multifaceted.
Thank you. Have you anything you would like to add to that, Mr.
No, I agree with everything.
That's good, that's helpful, thank you.
Right. Dean Lockhart, very quickly.
Thank you very quickly. For Mr Thompson, I appreciate you won't have the precise numbers, but roughly what percentage of reports of retail abuse end up in prosecution? Do you have a rough idea?
No, I don't have the information. It's one of the challenges, although the offences are within that bigger umbrella, as we said, and we have processes in place for dealing with them. We don't have the opportunity as it stands at the moment to extract the reporting facilities of it intuitively. So it's difficult to answer.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. And very quickly, before we close this session, I want to just introduce Daniel Johnson, who is the member who's brought this bill forward, and give you the opportunity if you wish to ask any questions.
Thank you, Convener. Can I also just remind the committee that I am a member of USDA, the Shop Workers Union, and I also am a director in a business that has retail interests. I was just wondering if I could ask Mr Thompson, first of all, if he could explain the utility of Section 90 of the Police and Fire Reform Act.
Right. Remind me the Section 90, the utility of that.
So this is the one which describes it being an offence for a person to assault a person acting in the capacity of a police officer and creates an offence of obstructing or hindering a police officer.
So, sorry, what's your question in relation to that again?
Is that a useful bit of legislation that was passed into law a mere matter of years ago in 2013?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a useful bit of legislation in relation to us carrying out
and if there are already there's a common law offence of assault, why was it necessary to re-articulate that specifically in this legislation?
I understand from the information I have to hand is that it was recognising the potential threat to life and impact in relation to the action of an individual towards emergency workers, in particular police officers and fire officers, and the consequences that could result on that. I understand, but I wasn't involved in the conversation, if I'm honest.
So if I could also just briefly ask, I would wonder if the panel would recognise that through Challenge 25 and other measures, and the legal requirements placed upon retail workers to ensure that people buying age-restricted items, would you think it's fair to say that retail workers, when they're when they're conducting those age checks, are upholding the law, and in that regard are acting as agents of the law?
It's about definition, really, I suppose.
Are they upholding the law or not?
I definitely think they play an important part in relation to upholding the law, absolutely. And I've said that earlier on, that is a key element of keeping people safe. The law is there primarily to prevent harmful products, harmful items coming into communities with people who effectively have not been seen fit to be in possession of those things. So absolutely, shop workers who are providing that ability to stop that item getting into there absolutely make a really valuable contribution to the wider safety of the community.
And so just finally, I was just wondering if both panellists would reflect that when people are upholding the law, and indeed they do so, and they can have sanctions of up to a year in prison for failing to do so, it is only right that they have the specific protection of the law, such as police officers have under Section 90 of the Police and Fire Reform Act.
I mean, I think we've answered the question in the sense that we alluded to differences in the position between the police and perhaps the person. Totally accept that they are interacting because they're upholding the law. And I think that important bit as a precursor to what then maybe follows to them, which is prosecuted criminally, is very important and is part of the, if you like, part of the circumstances of the offence. If that particular circumstance, it's creating what happens, if you like, it's the initiation that creates what happens afterwards. I would suggest that offences already take account of that factor. If not specific enough, if you like, punishment is being given, then that's almost a different matter, which I think I referred to earlier in one of the questions that was asked.
And just on a final comment, Convener, if I may, the Emergency Workers Act has been used 8,251 times since it was passed into legislation, and was used almost 100 times last year. Almost 100 offences were convicted under that legislation.
Just for a point of clarification on that, the somebody who's selling a restricted age product is required to comply with the law and uphold the law as they know it. But if there is any kind of breach of that law, it is in fact the police that are called to deal with that, as opposed to the shop worker. And the prevention, the protection for police officers in the Act, as it was passed, is to prevent somebody from hindering the police officer from arresting or getting to the person, or stopping them from dealing with an incident.
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you ever so much. Can I thank you very much for the evidence you've given? It was helpful, and we'll suspend the committee for a couple of minutes while we change the panels. Thank you. Right, we'll recommence the committee. We are quite short of time, given that we're dealing with 3 panels today. So I'd like to welcome the next panel. So we have Dr. Pete Jima, that's my pronunciation here, Chief Exec of the Scottish Grocers Federation. We have Ewan MacDonald-Russell, Head of Policy and External Affairs from the Scottish Retail Consortium. Paul Tonieri. This is a challenge for me today. Who is our Senior Policy Manager Scotland for the Scottish Beer and Pub Association, and Paul Gerard, Campaigns and Public Affairs Director of the Cooperative Group. So welcome, gentlemen. And again, we have a series of questions from the members, and you can decide who wants to answer it. Obviously, we're going to be short of time for all 4 of you to answer, so if we can try and keep it quite tight. Okay, so we're going to start with Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. I know that USDA will be in the next panel, but I actually have to quote from USDA's submission. Customer under influence refused alcohol and became abusive and threatened staff. Belsill, in my own constituency, because Scottish licensing laws are not clear to customers, I receive abuse on a regular occurrence. Irvine, daily abuse from customer under influence of alcohol. Glasgow, couldn't sell alcohol before 10 AM, got an earful and told I'd ruined her life. So the committee are aware of concerns about high levels of violence and abuse directed at retail workers, and the situation may be getting worse. How would you describe the current state of affairs What are the causes? Is some abuse due to the changes in the licensing law, no selling before 10 a.m? And what would you do to remedy this? Mr. Gerard.
You asked what's the scale of the problem, essentially. The latest data we've got for the Cork Group, and we've got 350 stores in Scotland, we've seen a 1,800% rise between the end of quarter 3 and the end of quarter 3 2017 and the end of quarter 3 2019 of abuse. So there's 1,800% more cases of abuse in that 2-year period. There's 650% more cases of violence in the period from the end of quarter 3 2017 to the end of quarter 3 2019. So some of that is due to better reporting, absolutely, but some of it is due to a broader thing here, which you see in USDOR or in the BRC data that says shop worker violence is getting worse. Not only are the incidences getting worse, but the level of violence and abuse are getting worse. It is at levels that my colleagues in the Corp have never seen. And if I may just put the voice of one of my colleagues into the room, and it speaks to the point about alcohol. A customer was refused a bottle of wine, which she took exception to. It resulted in the customer assaulting 3 members of the team store, as well as another customer. The police were called. She was eventually arrested, charged and released. My 67-year-old colleague on the till was left shaken and confused as to why she should put up with this level of abuse. And it is in Scotland now, every week, pushing 100 of my colleagues just in the co-op stores, and others on this panel will say the same. 100 colleagues either abused or attacked.
So are these assaults all during the day, or is there, you know, the point that my particular question I want to ask is there assaults between 9 o'clock and 10 a.m. in the morning, or assaults, you know, because some cooperative stores are open to 11 o'clock at night, some 24 hours?
The most common time for assaults is between 12 and 6.
12 and 6?
Yeah, however, there are a significant number of assaults, probably about a quarter of all incidents happen before 12. I don't have the data before 10, but I can find it for you and send a committee a note. That would be helpful. Others and colleagues.
You wanted to add something?
I'm not going to give you any statistics, because for the last 5 years, in my role as Chief Executive of the SGF, we've done just that. Every year we provide you with statistics. We're at a parliamentary reception and we tell you exactly the same. We've ran campaigns. We've done all of that. Everything that the previous panel had said. We've had enough, you know. I came here in 1988 to Scotland, and I was shocked at the torrent of abuse that I had. We have 248 age-restricted products to deal with. We are legislating, and you're legislating, and we are having to deal with all of that every single day. I've been spat at, I've been called names, I've been threatened, I've been attacked, I've had my tyres slashed, I've had my windows broken. Now, that's not just in one store. I've had stores right across Scotland. That is current. Legislation changes from time to time. When I came here in 1988, you know, the amount of racial abuse I used to suffer was incredible. And it wasn't until the Race Relations Act 2000 was amended that, you know, people stopped calling me Packy or black bastard. And that changed. It changed the culture, it changed the attitude. And what needs to now happen is this amendment needs to go through in order for retail workers to be able to do their job properly, to do it in a safe environment. I was told that it's a low-level crime. Is it really? Retailers who are giving these products away, let's say for example, they break the law and they give one of these age-restricted products out to somebody who they shouldn't do. A low-level worker who's earning between £8 and £9 an hour at the national minimum wage is going to be fined £5,000. And yet, it's low-level? Really? And then the police don't come out because it's perceived as a low-level crime. So then we talk about under-reporting. Really? What do you expect them to do when they don't have no faith in the police, they have no faith in the Procurator Fiscal? It's time that this changed.
That silenced everybody. Mr. Russell, you want to come in?
Just as a follow-up, during the course of this evidence session this morning, it's statistically probable a retail worker will be abused. It's 9 incidents a day, hundreds and thousands across it from the BRC Crime Survey. We will have an updated crime survey out later this week. We will send it on to the committee when it's published. In terms of response to Mr. Lyle's question, the SRC has been supportive of measures to tackle alcohol. We support the process has come forward. We implemented, I think, minimum unit pricing 2 weeks after the price was set by this Parliament. What we are talking about here, though, is that our workers and colleagues are having to deal with the consequence of initiating public policy, and they're happy to do that. That's our duty. We work on behalf, and as we see society changing, as we see more duties being placed on retail workers, we accept that that's something we can do, and we play our role in the community. What we're talking about here, though, is finding a mechanism and a way to do it. The status quo isn't acceptable. Every way you look at it, whether you look at individual experiences, national stats, the experience of my members, of Pete's members, of everyone. So something has to be done. We think a form of aggravation is the right way. We're very supportive, though, of Mr. Johnson's bill, but this is more a case of, the status quo isn't acceptable, and we're asking for help for our workers, to be honest.
Paul?
Yeah, no, I'd concur with the messages conveyed by my colleagues on the panel. Since 2005, when we actually introduced on a voluntary basis Challenge 25 as a process, we've seen an increase in the number of instances where you'd have a challenge or there'd be an altercation, and that is when most of these occurrences of abuse happen. That, of course, came in as a statutory requirement in 2010, requiring everybody under the age of 25 to be asked for ID. That has increased the number of instances where there could be abuse. Again, talking specifically to Mr. Lyle's point regarding a Licensing Act and changes there, I believe that at this current moment, the laws regarding licensing cover go across about 5 different acts. Something we have called for, and colleagues across this panel have called for, as a consolidated act. That would be helpful, but separately, this member's bill would do something specifically to address the issue of abuse which our staff are face on a daily basis and is increasing.
Yeah, this bill actually would cover people who work in pubs also. Yes. Mr. Chima, I certainly feel, and stand with you in regard to your comments. Abuse, racial abuse or otherwise, is certainly should be opposed, and I can understand why you're so really tell me about it. I've no words to say. But there is a perception that the abuse of retail workers is not always taken serious enough. Do you agree that this is a problem, and if so, what impact does it have?
The impact really is huge. It's, people who work in retail are usually family or people that they know, people that work in the community, and the knock-on effect is huge. Often people don't want to work at the counter because they know they're going to get abuse, so they just rather do something else. But we're the biggest private sector employer. We need this protection. You asked about earlier on to the previous panel about sales between 9 and 10 o'clock. We've had a scenario where somebody comes in, wants to buy alcohol before the permitted time. He's refused the sale. The retailer can't do anything. All he can do is refuse. So the person decides to take the product and decides to throw the money down, and he's decided that he's purchased it. Now, I'll ask all of you, what would you do? So if you phone the police, would they come out? Has something actually taken place? I'll tell you what happens. The police will say, well, did you get paid for it? Yes. So what's your problem? That's just one scenario whereby this act actually kicks in.
I'm certainly not advocating that anybody does that.
I understand,
but you say that
that happens. That happens. But we've also got 248 of age-restricted products to deal with. The age, the 25 scenario was actually introduced by the Scottish Grocers Federation many, many years ago, even before it was legislated. We are responsible retailers. All we ask is that the legislation that you pass on to us will help us to deliver that.
Okay. Thank you.
Just two builds on that. We've done a freedom of information request across all 43 constabularies in the UK about police response rates to issues that we report in our store. And it really just puts some evidence on what Mr. Chima said, which is that, and this is UK-wide data, a number of police forces haven't yet responded, which one of them is Police Scotland, but so if we get that data, we'll provide it. But just to give you an idea across the country, across the UK, 2 out of 3, and bear in mind that only the most serious offences will be reported to the police because there's little confidence in a response. So it's a bit of a vicious circle. 2/3 of issues reported to the police result in no police attendance. 2/3, and that will be the kind of incidents that Mr. Chima described, the kind of incident that I can describe. 2/3 of the time, the police do not attend. Is point number one. I think the second point to make is the impact on colleagues is not just immediate, but it lasts a long time. Dr. Emmeline Taylor did some research that we published last year called "It's Not Part of the Job." I'll happily provide it to the committee. She talked about the consequences of some of these of the abuse and attack shop workers face as being akin to PTSD. And I think the last point I would make is that, as Mr. Chima said, many of our colleagues will need to work. They'll need to work in that shop. It may be the only shop they can work in. If they've been attacked in that shop, they will need to return to the place of their trauma. You would never normally ask anyone who has suffered such trauma to go back to the place that they suffered it. Honestly, I think we would all agree. Retail workers don't believe the police care, they don't believe the criminal justice care, and they're not sure whether their elected representatives care about them because so little is being done.
Can I just add one point to that? The Co-op and the Scot Mid have put processes in place with their local police station whereby they will fill out the forms, they will take the video evidence, both audio and visual, they'll then send that on to the police station, deliver it themselves so that the whole process can be speeded up. And do you know something? It takes us police sometimes 4 to 6 weeks to respond to the work that's already been done.
That's good. Mr. Harry, you wanted to add
Yeah,
something?
no, just to build on what Mr. Gerrard said there around the perception of shop workers, and it's certainly the same case with bar workers, that the perception is that the law is very much not on their side, and the fact that it's up to them to uphold the law. You're told a lot around the restrictions that you will have as a worker in terms of who you can sell to, what state they can be in, who they can be sold, and you're also told that you face a £5,000 penalty should you fail to uphold some of these restrictions. So anything that sends the message to retail workers that the law is on their side, the Parliament does support them, would be a welcome addition. I don't think there has been much in the previous 5 to 10 years which have sent a clear message of support to workers, and I believe this bill would do that. That's one of the reasons that we welcome it. It would also, to our belief, further highlight those instances and lead to an increase in reporting of instances. Many retail workers, as been highlighted here, don't think that there will be much action taken as a result, as it's a low-level crime. It is part of the job, some would say, and it's to be expected in that line of work. We don't think that that's true. I don't think that should be a reasonable excuse, and this bill helps end that view, in our opinion.
Okay, I'm going to come to Jackie Bailey because I think she wants to explore these issues a bit more.
Some of them have already been explored by the panel. The police, as you may have heard earlier, in evidence to us said, all of these threats, intimidation, violence towards retail workers, they're all taken seriously, they're all investigated. I have to say that's not my experience, and it doesn't sound as if it's the experience of your members. Is the 2/3 that you've described, Mr. Gerard, typical? Is that across the board, or is that just within your stores? I'd be curious to know.
So the 2/3 figure is from a Freedom of Information across all 43 constabularies in the UK. Not all constabularies have responded. Not all constabularies hold the data. That data does not include Police Scotland, because Police Scotland, as you heard earlier, don't hold the data. I would be surprised if it's that different between constabularies. Point number one. Point number two, it is not our experience that police will come out when an incident is reported. I'm a former law enforcement officer. I worked for Customs and Excise for 20 years. I have nothing but support and sympathy for police officers, but they are very stretched and they do not consider this to be a priority, is the truth. And if you ask my colleagues in store, the 5,000 my colleagues in corp stores in Scotland, they would agree that the police will very rarely come out to incidents.
Do you think passing this legislation will make the police change their minds about how they behave?
I think there's I think there's a number of things. I think it will send an important message, and sometimes legislation is about the message it sends. Mr. Chima's experience of the racial relations act is a really good example of that. I think it will send a message. I think it will also it will also make clear, and when I was in Customs and Excise, under Section 16 of the Customs and Excise Management Act, I was afforded protection because I was carrying out public duties. The same in HMRC now, it's Section 31. I look at what my colleagues do for those 240-odd age-restricted items, and they're doing what I used to do in Customs, and I was abused and I was threatened, but I had protection, and that made me feel that I wasn't on my own. And I think too often, shop colleagues, as Mr. Chima just described, the gentleman at 9 in the morning refusing alcohol, feel on their own. So that messaging, I would not underestimate the importance of that messaging to thousands and hundreds of thousands of retail staff. So.
Let's assume, because I'm assuming you all agree, so forgive me, I'll move on to the next question. Let's assume you get past the barrier that is the police. What happens with prosecution in the courts? Are you confident about prosecution and sentencing? Dr. Chima.
Nobody ever comes back.
Okay.
The process is there, but it doesn't happen. And that's reality. In terms of your earlier question, data recording, we know that the police don't record, but neither do the Scottish Government. And again, I want to go back to the Race Relations Amendment Act 2000. At that time, none of the race crimes were recorded. It wasn't until after that it started to get recorded. But we can't wait another 5 or 10 years for this law to be passed and carry on in the same vein. We just can't. We need this now. And we need it to, not only to give our retail workers the confidence, but it sends out a message that from yourselves that crime has zero tolerance.
Mr. Tonieri, is there a difference in the pub sector, or is it the same experience?
I'd say that it differs, and to be honest, it differs in area, and it'll differ from pub to pub regarding the situation. I would think. But we definitely share the message that which Mr. Shima, Dr. Shima, is conveying here, and that is entirely unacceptable, and we would entirely back that.
Okay, thank you, convener.
Okay, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Convener, the police said that when dealing with young people who've been abusive or whatever, it's sometimes appropriate to use measures other than prosecution. Main reason being to avoid a negative impact of a criminal record on their futures, just building problems for times to come. What are your views on that?
Turn this round to you. What's your view on a retail worker breaking the law in order to protect the young person?
That's an impossible question to answer.
Is that not an impossible question for us to answer? Because as far as I'm concerned, it should be zero tolerance. If somebody's breaking the law, they're breaking the law. But we are unable to deal with it because there is nothing in place, and yet there is something in place for the retail worker.
But if we look at this logically, are we in danger, possibly, of criminalising a whole group of young people as a result of this? Is it necessary? Is it what we should be doing? And I'm thinking here where we bring in situations where there's obstruction and hindrance and so on, which is at the moment a fairly uncertain offence. Are we not in danger of criminalising young people unnecessarily here?
So what's the difference between somebody, a young person going ahead and slapping somebody, or putting a knife into somebody, then threatening a shop worker to sell an age-restricted product?
But
What's the difference?
I think I did say we have no definition as yet of what obstruction or hindrance might be. Yeah.
I think probably there's a couple of points which hopefully directly address the question. On the point about young people, one of the aims we hope of this offence of putting this recognition of retail workers and their right to be protected is about a deterrence element. We don't actually want young people to do this. We want them to recognise that shop workers deserve not to be abused or to be hindered at. So there's an element where we don't actually want prosecutions. Prosecution is in some ways a failure of this because it would imply that this is continuing. We're trying to stop that. A point about hindrance, I think there's some, I think certainly how that's clarified is very important. I'm not nearly qualified enough in criminal law on the details, but certainly, particularly when you're looking at intentionality around that, we've noted in the written evidence that we have to be very cautious about ensuring that that's appropriate and done. And as I say, if there are other ways, it's not something that I think would be primary for us, but it is more that point on, are we creating a fence to change the way that retail workers are looked at and how they're protected? So that's how I'd respond to that, if that's okay.
So I absolutely agree that I am here and I will defend and speak up for the safety of my colleagues. Absolutely. I think there is a difference then in terms of what happens next. And I think what I thought the Mr. Thompson from Police Scotland said extremely well is that ultimately it is the outcome. In some cases, that might be a prosecution that leads to a custodial sentence, or fine. But in many cases, particularly for young people, it may be about different kinds of interventions. So to give you an example, that isn't Scottish, I'm afraid, so I apologise for that, but it will apply. An offender in the Midlands, in England, had a £1,000 a week habit, substance abuse, crack, heroin. Therefore, she had to steal about £160,000 a year from stores. She did that for 20 years, from the age of 14 to 34. What stopped her is that eventually she was put on a rehabilitation course and she got treatment. She has now not offended in 3 years. Moreover, she is now back counselling younger people about not to get into that kind of environment. So I guess I absolutely agree that it is not acceptable ever to attack a shop worker for any reason. What then happens to that offender is important, and sometimes it may be custodial for safety, but let's not lose sight of the ability to change people's lives, because that does exist and must exist.
I mean, we can all quote extremes of what might happen with retail workers, and to use Dr. Chim's example, pulling a knife or whatever, I mean, that is already a criminal offence and would be dealt with fairly seriously. What I'm trying to understand is where we have this offence of obstruction or hindrance, where does that fall? What are the extremes in that? How do you determine what is criminal and what isn't? It seems to be very difficult, and should we not look at this actually, whether this is a more general offence then, not just to retail workers, but other people about their business as well? Should they not be protected in the same way? And I'm thinking of, people that are in, the utility services and all the rest of it, who are also subject to abuse from time to time. What specific example can you give of obstruction or hindrance that would sort of crystallise that in our minds?
slightly different for retail workers, possibly in two different scenarios. Is the first one, unlike I think any other profession, and by the way, if there is an analogous example, we'd be supportive of that too, is you can't control the space and you can't control people coming in and doing things in the space that you're in your physical premises. So that's where there's a distinction from other roles, I'd suggest, that little element there. I think the other bit where it's just thinking about how, and the right way to approach it again, is remember that when we look at retail now, we're not just talking, it's not just that store environment. We have online, we have hospitality, the way that sort of interacts, and that creates a lot of scenarios where we're going to have people who are either with two people, if that's manageable, or often an individual on their own. And I think those are the scenarios where we're trying to find the right mechanism for protection. Now, if there are specific issues with the hindering obstruction part, again, it's more how you get to that. Do we find the right way to prevent that worker, somebody holding them or someone blocking them from getting out of flat? In that case, someone's blockading a bit of the store. It's these examples that at the moment there's nothing that can be done beyond, as you say, involving the police when it gets serious. I think that's what we're grasping at here. We absolutely recognise it's a difficult area.
But I still haven't got any sort of definition which, clarifies in my mind what obstruction and hindrance would be and what point it would trigger criminality.
So you're asking for a scenario. Let's work on a scenario. If somebody comes in, let's say before the permitted time, and requests an age-restricted product, and the retailer says, "I'm sorry, but you can't have that. It's not the correct time. You've got to come back after 10 o'clock," or whatever the case may be. He then decides to take that further on and insists upon having that product. It's morally been discussed with him that they're not allowed to do it, that they will get a £5,000 fine if they do it. That's when it would trigger, because that person then becomes abusive.
I think where it's an age-related product, it's a specific area of concern, and I think there's, to me, in my mind, there's slightly different arguments for that. But in the generality, someone in a general retail situation, what would be obstruction and hindrance outside of age-related products?
The age-restricted products is the main issue.
They're the main issue.
It is the main issue.
That's really what's
it is the main issue. But we're also being hindered in terms of carrying out our duties, and carrying out our duties are the legal obligations that the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament have given the retail workers.
But what example do we have of that? I mean, I understand with age-related products, I've got a lot of sympathy there, and I think that's a separate issue. But in general...
Sorry, when you say separate issue, what do you mean?
It's a separate issue insofar as it's a definable issue where there's already a considerable concern about. And I think that, certainly in my mind, it's a separate thing from the generality of the retail trade.
But surely if they're being stopped from carrying out their duty, they're also hindered as well. But because then a queue forms, let's say, for example, all right, and the second and third person has got to get to work, they can't carry on and carry on with their duties. Surely that's an hindrance.
Seems to me what you're... Perhaps I can just finish that.
Yeah, I think you need to wind it up.
I don't think we're going anywhere on that particular one, but I mean, it seems to me that for age-related products, which are the main examples you're giving, in fact the only examples so far, that these perhaps need a separate look at from the generality of the retail trade, but I'll leave it at that just now.
Yeah, I think just to wind that up, I think what you're really saying is there are other jobs that they have to be getting on with, and they can be hindered from getting on with those jobs if somebody's kicking up a fuss around an age-related product.
Well, the average number of staff in a retail environment in the convenience sector is probably between 2 to 3 at any given time.
Yeah. Right, I'm going to move on because we're getting short of time, but I will give some time at the end if you want to pick up on anything. Alison Harris.
Convener, I would like to withdraw this question, please, having heard previous evidence.
And do you have some other questions? Do you want to pick up on those or not at this point?
I want to come in later.
Okay, that's fine. Dean Knockhart.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Very briefly, we're looking at the position in Scotland for obvious reasons, but I wonder if any of the panel could indicate whether there are powers elsewhere in the UK, more effective powers elsewhere in the UK, that deal with some of the concerns raised.
I mean, from our point of view, this is an issue that my BRC colleagues are campaigning across the 4 nations of the UK. We want to see action taken in this area. Scotland is, at the moment, a little bit ahead of where everyone else is. We'd like you to lead on this one, if that's okay, but it's something where we're looking for certainly more powers, more protections across the board. And I would say, just in response to the earlier issue about data, to substantiate Mr. Gerrard's point, we collect data across our whole membership, which is Scottish and UK. We don't see a huge change in the trend, but we do see an increase in the problem.
The Court's been running a campaign on Safe Colleagues, Safe Communities for the past 18 months. Ewan's absolutely right. Scotland are ahead on this. The debates in Westminster, there was a PMQ last week, there was Westminster Hall debate. 2 weeks ago, there was Westminster Hall debate before the UK general election. They're nowhere near this point. There's a private members bill a week today from Alex Norris, who's the Labour and Co-op MP for Nottingham North, which is similar to Mr Johnston's. But at the minute, while there is a recognition of the seriousness of the issue, there is the rest of the UK is nowhere near as advanced in these kind of conversations. There's been no conversation I've seen in Westminster that's been at this level of detail and clarity.
Thank you. And just so I understand the nature of the problem in terms of the examples of the abuse, the examples of concerns, is it the same across the UK, or are you facing particular issues in Scotland?
I can speak for the Co-op group. We've got 2,500 stores across the UK. They're pretty similar. It's issues to do with challenging shoplifters that causes violence and abuse. It's to do with age-related sales, and it's due to general abusive behaviour in stores. And it's pretty similar whether you're in Glasgow or you're in Gillingham.
The only differentiation we'd see is between type of store. Larger format stores which tend to have more colleagues, and it's better able for members to be able to do more to support. It's harder, although obviously our members who do that do a huge amount on putting security, CCTV, etc. into more convenience format, but it's harder the fewer people you've got, and it's overall a huge challenge.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you.
Okay, Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. So Mr Chima and Mr Gerrard, you both said that there's very little faith in the police or the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service in terms of prosecuting people who are assaulting or threatening or abusing shop workers, retail workers. Is it your position then that this legislation would change that? Because on the face of it, legislation in and of itself is not going to change if the problem is that the law enforcement and prosecution services are not following up what they should be at the moment.
We heard the previous panel say it's low-level crime, and low-level crime doesn't get picked up by the police. They just don't deal with it. I mean, there's been instances in the past. I mean, it's not something that we're covering today.
So are you saying? I mean, we mustn't take those comments out of context, but I don't think the person from the Law Society was saying that assault was low-level.
Well, she. I mean, if you go back, what she said was that these type of crimes, and I quote, are low-level.
Okay, so is your position therefore that the crimes that are being specified in Section 1 of this bill are not low level? Because they vary from assault to hindering.
As I mentioned earlier, I think any type of crime, shouldn't be tolerated.
Yes, no, I understand that. What I'm trying to get at is that if your members and if retail workers do not have confidence in the police and the Crown Office at the moment, what difference will legislation that in effect restates some of the law that already exists, what difference will it actually make?
I think it will give them a bit of faith that somebody's out there is listening to them. I think it will enforce...
But will it make any difference? That's the point. I mean, I'm sure absolutely that if Parliament passes this bill or something in broadly its shape, it will provide a lot of reassurance and all the rest of it. But if that is not followed through in enforcement, then we're just gesticulating.
I think, so I wouldn't underestimate the power of a sovereign parliament gesticulating, because I think it can be really powerful. Okay, I think it will also be powerful to law enforcement, because the truth is it is not prioritised. There is an aggravated offence that carries presumably a higher tariff that will very often prompt a better police response. There does come down the issue, I said before, I speak as a former law enforcement officer, they need the resources to be able to respond. They're not responding out of they're not responding out of badness or wickedness. They're not responding because they don't have the resources to. And therefore there is something about, alongside this legislation, that will increase the importance, okay? Because Scottish Parliament has passed that act, it will increase importance. What needs to flow to that is that the police put resources in and have the resources to put in. Because the truth is, and apologies, I speak more from a UK perspective than a Scottish particularly, but the cuts across the police services have hit neighbourhood policing, which were the very people who would often respond to issues in schools.
Okay, now I understand the question about resources, obviously, but if you elevate one element of the the criminal justice system and offences, and you don't change the resources, then the deficit will just fall elsewhere.
But policing is all about prioritisation.
No, I understand that, but we are not, as a committee, scrutinising budgets of police or anything like that. I just want to talk about the age-related statutory aggravation. I think, as Colin Beattie indicated, I think we're well, I am, and Colin Beattie said he was, I can't speak for other members of the committee, quite sympathetic to doing something in that area because, as you say, you're, the people who work in retail are providing a public service that we've asked them to do. We've asked them to do that. The problem with this bill, however, in relation to that, is that the aggravation only applies to the Section 1 offences. It may or may not be that Parliament doesn't approve some or all of those Section 1 offences, in which case the aggravation will fall away, if you follow me. I'm just speculating what Parliament might do. We don't know what it'll do, but it may take the view that these offences are already covered and therefore they don't need them. And the consequence of that is the aggravation provisions in the bill will also fall. I want to ask you whether the aggravation offences should be applied to not only the Section 1 offences, but to any offence against a shop worker that's decided to be prosecuted under the common law or the Criminal Justice and Licensing Act 2010, because it doesn't apply to them at the moment.
So from the SRC, the answer would, I think, with having tried to read through quickly to make sure I'm covering it, would be yes. We think broadly that a broader aggravation approach supporting things is the easier way to do it. It's not that we're not supportive to new offence that. We think whatever's the easiest way that ensures that we're catching these offences properly. And of course, there's even things like the kind of temporal elements around this, that somebody refuses an age-related sale and somebody gets them later in the car park or that. It's how this is kind of, amended or how it developed to allow that we capture those sort of things. We would not be particularly precious about the exact way that that kind of outcome gets to there. So apologies for not giving a very specific answer, but I don't want to get it wrong.
No, but let's take the hypothetical situation that Section 1 does fall away, or part of it falls away, say the obstructing and hindrance falls away. I mean, is it your position that you'd like the aggravation offences that apply to retail workers in retail premises, you'd like that aggravation in respect of any prosecution taken against somebody who is assaulting or threatening a retail worker, whether or not that prosecution is being taken forward in respect of these offences?
Yes.
Okay, and you all agree with that?
I think that would be helpful, and it would go a long way to sort of starting that cultural shift and sending that message that we've all highlighted. So yes.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, what is your response to the evidence from the Law Society of Scotland, the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, the memorandum from the Scottish Government, that all of the offences in Section 1 are covered already? So assault's covered by the common law, threatening and abusing is covered by the 2010 Criminal Justice Act. The obstructing and hindering, according to the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service, could be prosecuted under breach of the peace. The aggravation is already covered by the prosecution guidance in terms of course of employment. What's your response to that? I understand that it's not happening, the police are not investigating, not being prosecuted, but the argument is that the laws are there to deal with this situation as it stands at the moment.
Very briefly, so I don't repeat myself, I think it's about identifying and recognising retail workers slightly different, retail places are slightly differently. It's, in our case, obviously from an aggravation perspective, of adding and ensuring that the penalties are more sufficient and are more of a deterrence effect. I think there's a final small point, which might sound inconsequential, but it's not. A lot of the things that we're going to be, that are sometimes very difficult, are things that will be very, very hard ever to be identified in law, that kind of sort of microaggressions, things that might be abusive or not, where there's not going to be corroboration, a single person speaking at a checkout where there's no audio or colleagues. I think what happens when you create an offence that makes it clear retail workers are different and deserve protection is it can change the calculus for people in that circumstance. It makes the worker feel a bit more confident that shouldn't happen, and it makes customers just have to think a bit differently about the respect they bring. That's a minor thing, and that's a cultural shift, and that's partly why I think we mustn't underestimate the value of a legislative approach of changing that culture for already people who might be frustrated that they don't take it out on the worker. That's what we're trying to reach at in a very general point.
Okay, and just finally, Mr. Russell, MacDonald Russell, I just wanted to pick up on a point you made earlier, which is you said that the retail environment is different because members of the public have got unhindered access to it, unlike, say, an office or this Parliament where there are controls at the door, or can be controls at the door, in terms of who gets access to a solicitor's office or this Parliament, or whatever. I mean, in your mind, is that quite an important factor in your support for this bill? How significant is that?
I think that the nature of how retail works and that responsibility to engage with everyone is quite important. It's the closest analogy, and there are lots of reasons why this isn't analogous to the Emergency Workers Act, but there is one bit in the original justification which spoke about how those workers will always be vulnerable because they cannot control their circumstance. They have to go to places. That's more and more true of retail workers, that element. The other parts about the life-saving and that obviously aren't analogous. The point about not controlling environment, I think, it's a relevant criteria, and that's why we draw on it.
Okay, thank you.
There are circumstances in retail where there's lone worker situations, and the difference is really for the retailers making sure that they can carry out their duties in a safe and proper environment, you know, without being hindered and aggravated in carrying out their legal duty.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Alison Harris, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I really wanted just to come in at the end and ask that, you know, would you like to see any changes made to the proposals in this bill?
From our perspective, a lot of age verification checks will actually take place at the premises door via door staff. So we would like to see the legislation branched out to include protections for those staff, which will be on the front line of age verification checks in many situations.
Okay, does anyone else have anything to add?
I think for us it carries out everything that we require.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I'd be interested, we work very closely with USDOR, I'd be interested to see what USDOR say in their next session, but it's not that usual that all the major trade bodies and major employers and unions are speaking with the same voice on the same issue. It's been very noticeable in the debates across the UK that the major retailers and USDOR are absolutely as one on this.
Thank you.
Gordon MacDonald.
A couple of very quick questions just because of the time constraints we've got, but before I ask them, I think it would be helpful if we could get a level of clarification of the number of workers that this bill would protect, whether it's in the convenience store sector or whether it's in the bar and club sector. Are you able to say how many workers that this bill would protect?
In terms of retail, there's 44,000 workers in Scotland. Right. That doesn't include the beer and pub and hospitality sector.
Right.
Scottish. Oh, sorry.
From our perspective, I promise this isn't meant. It's 45,000 across pubs in Scotland.
Okay. Most recent Scottish Annual Business Survey has about 240,000 retail workers.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much for that. It just helps paint the picture of what this bill could do. You know, we've talked a lot today about we need a culture change, possibly similar to seatbelt legislation or drink driving laws or whatever. We need to send that message that abuse of retail workers isn't acceptable. But to be honest, this bill isn't a panacea for all the ills that the convenience store sector, the pub and club sector actually face. So what other action would the sector like to see in order to help protect retail workers that isn't included in this bill?
As I said before, I think Scotland is ahead of the rest of the UK on this issue in general. One of the things that the UK Home Office did last year, which I think was helpful, was a public awareness campaign. But I say public awareness, really focused on, but more to do with shop workers and getting shop workers to be comfortable and confident to report abuse. It was hashtag Always Report Abuse, run by the Association of Convenience Stores in England and Wales. I think that was really helpful. I think it began to get through to colleagues that, well, two things. It encouraged colleagues to report, number one. Also encouraged businesses to make sure they do the right thing. I don't agree with what the Law Society said before about businesses may prevent or discourage colleagues from reporting abuse. I've never seen that. It's certainly not true. The COP. I'll be very surprised if it's true of very many. But I think there's something about a public awareness, or certainly sector awareness campaign about the importance of abuse and about the unacceptability of abuse.
Okay.
I think from our point of view, there's kind of 3 points around coherency. I think, just to echo Mr. Gerard's point, from our members, and we speak a lot, there's a huge amount of work gone into protecting work. I think over the UK, it's something like over £1 billion a year spent by our members on protecting workers, on crime prevention, and that will continue, and that's fine. And we want to work in partnership with police. The Scottish Citizens Resilience Centre is a good example. But there's a third point, and actually it's one a little bit on this building. It's that coherency of public policy. Lots of the triggers for the activity we're seeing are the consequence of public policy decisions. Some of those are good decisions and we support them, but it's how that's done coherently, clearly. It's about ensuring that that's heard and that we have a strategic approach. And obviously, we're working with government on a retail strategy. I think that kind of wider, more sectoral work on just understanding all the impacts is essential, because this is one of the bits that doesn't often get thought about when we talk about public policy measures that retail workers enact.
Okay. Just in that point that you raised about was it £1 billion that your members spend on protecting workers? Can you give us a flavour of the nature of that spend? You know, because obviously employers have a duty of care on their employees, and you know, convenience store sector, you know, a lot of them are family owned, so they want to protect their family members. Same with bar and pubs. I mean, so what are your various sectors doing in order to protect employees or other family members?
I can speak for the Co-op, and I'm conscious that although we're a relatively big business, we are a small format business, which is a slightly different. And also we wholesale to lots of family-owned independents or independent cooperative societies like Scott Mid. I think we have spent and will spend about £140 million UK wide in the last 3 years and the coming 3 years. It's about 20 odd million pounds in our Scottish stores. I think there's a few things. There's some physical stuff, guards. There's also how you design the store, where you put certain products. There's a physical bit there. I think one of the most important things we've done is in relation to technology, to connect colleagues on the shop floor. As Dr. Cheeman said, sometimes, particularly in the convenience environment, you'll have 3-4 colleagues in store, and if one's in the back and one's at the till and one's so all our colleagues have headsets. They can all speak to each other at any point. I think that's important. But we've also, I think, connected our colleagues to a central control room provided by a private supplier, which enables them to be connected to the outside world. So if there's an incident and they press the alarm button, that store is taken over by the central control function, and they begin to gather the evidence to send to the police, and they'll instruct the colleagues what to do and put out announcements. So I think you need to spend money. My worry would be a big business like the Co-op can afford to spend what is equivalent to about £8,000 a year on security measures on average. But actually, many of the most at-risk stores, the small family-run independents, do not have that kind of resource, and therefore are really at risk. We're at risk because of the nature of our format, small, local, community-based. You know, the equivalents on that in family-run businesses may not have that kind of money, and therefore are most at risk.
The only small build I'd make, and that's a far better explanation than I could give, is A, that obviously happens across it. A lot of times what we're seeing is retailers acting almost as quasi-judicial bodies now, where if somebody is behaving in a way that is sort of bad, but the police aren't going to take action or can't take action, you'll see things like customers being banned, you'll see internal processes. You'll also see a lot of support for workers, which probably doesn't count in that spend, but you know, recognising we're talking about post-traumatic stress, mental health support and the rest. There's a lot of that side of it too.
From ourselves, there's also the promotion of best practice via the Scottish Resilience Centre. We have the Best Bar None scheme, which all pubs in Scotland are eligible for. But it's also about partnership working as well. Pubs which may have a problem with violence, abuse or any issues will normally try and work to have the best relationship possible with licensing standing officers and the local police, ensuring that those connections are there is an important part for us as well.
Okay, thank you.
I think there's just one factor that's probably been missed from everything is that the amount of community work that retailers carry out in, making sure that ultimately they are safe, ultimately they get to know everybody, and that they try and get on with everybody to eradicate this kind of thing. Yes, we invest in CCTV and all the rest, but more and more people are becoming stressed in their work because of these situations, and that's why, we've employed the Retail Trust and through their Retail Hub to try and eradicate some of that and put services behind it. But it's very, very difficult and it's getting worse.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Mr Johnson, we're very tight for time, so unless there's anything really important you want to add.
Just ask the panel if they could just reflect on one point. In the previous panel, I think it was questioned about the legal protection, given that other categories of work are protecting life and limb. I'm just wondering if one of the panellists might reflect on the point that when retail workers are upholding the law regarding age-restricted items, it's items such as alcohol, tobacco, battery acid, offensive weapons. So to the degree that they're restricting access to those items, that there are very real life and limb consequences if they're sold inappropriately. Just maybe Mr Gerard, do you think that's a fair reflection?
I think it is. I mean, I think there are differences. Certainly we don't sell knives in our stores now because of the risk that it poses, but there are other things like acid, etc. And if they get into the wrong hands, they can have devastating consequences, as frankly can other age-related sales like alcohol, etc. Whether it's exactly the same, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't underestimate the implications of those products being sold in an unrestricted way, which is why Parliament brought in the safeguards.
Very much. Well, can I thank the witnesses? I think that was a very interesting session. If there's anything that hasn't been covered today that you think of after you leave, please write and let us know. And we'll suspend the committee just for a minute while we change over the panel. Thank you. Thank you, and good morning. Can I welcome Stuart Forrest, the Scottish Divisional Officer from Usdaw, and Robert Devey, pronounced as right, the organiser from GMB Scotland. And again, gentlemen, you've obviously just heard the session we've had, so we're looking to build on that, and we'll be really offering you the same questions. So can I start with Richard Lyle, please?
I'm actually going to quote from the USDA submission. Age-restricted sales, Broxburn. Customer very aggressive when refused sale of age-restricted products, particularly alcohol. Throwing goods. Inverurie. Customer threw items of their shopping at me as they were unhappy about the price. Shoplifters, Fife. Shoplifter tried to headbutt me. Belittling. Wick. Asked if I was stupid, spoken to like a child. Assault, Dingwall. One customer elbowed me on purpose when I went past. Verbal abuse, Dundee. I have had customers shout at me if something doesn't go right and called many names. Inverness, a woman was very upset about her lack of 10-pence bags and got very abusive. Finally, Edinburgh. After work, I've been stopped in the street going home, verbally abused by a family member of a shoplifter I caught previously that day. I felt very uncomfortable being put in a situation as these people know where I live and are known to be violent. Basically, can I ask you, just in what you're saying is this is happening all over Scotland and on a regular basis. Would you agree?
Yes, I do agree. Can I start, panel, by saying that a job in retail is a real job, just the same as a police officer, emergency service worker or a firefighter. A lot of people go into retail and spend their whole career in retail. So they are real jobs. Our members, to go on another question, Usdaw represents 30,000 members in retail in Scotland. And the survey that you quote is a survey which is part of Usdaw's Freedom from Fear campaign. It's a campaign that Usdaw has been running throughout the UK since 2003. We do have a Scottish specific survey as part of that campaign, and we have noticed since 2015 that assaults and abuse of our members in Scotland are significantly increasing. And the quotes that you've quoted there are from our 2019 survey, which we'd be happy to share with the committee if that was requested.
Many of the committee know this, and sadly I'm going to quote it. I was a grocery manager in a cooperative for 14 years in my early part of my career. But basically, lastly, the question I'll ask you, and again I'll quote from you, life on the front line of retail can be pretty tough for many shop workers, and there's still a lot to do to help to protect them. Your message is clear. Abuse is not part of your job. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Jackie Bailey.
You may have heard the police give evidence earlier. Then they say that any reports of threats, intimidation, violence against retail workers are all taken seriously. They're all thoroughly investigated. Is that the experience of your members?
It certainly is not the experience of Usdaw members, and as I say, through people participating in our surveys, they're telling us that that's not the case. It's not taken serious. They see things where people have been abusive of them, and if they're spending a lot of money in the store, they might be excluded for the store for that shopping visit, but then they're back in. And the majority of our members live in the community they work in, and that can cause problems outside of their work as well.
Okay, Robert Davey?
No, I had to deal with an incident in Blantyre about a year and a half, 2 years ago, where it was a consistent gang of youths that were effectively robbing the store in Blantyre. They were threatening the security guard with a knife, baseball bats, telling them they were going to stab him. And they were going to attack the staff if any get in their way. And the store were calling the police. The police were not turning up. They knew who these youths were. And it actually took a criticising article in one of the national newspapers for the police to actually act upon going to this store and dealing with this incident. I'll be happy to send that article on. It's easy to find. But our members in the GMB experience is that the police do not appear. Even crimes such as shoplifting, there's no point in really reporting this. The police will, they don't have the resources to deal with it. This bill, if it becomes law, I think will empower shop workers to feel more confident in reporting it. I believe at this moment in time, I mean, everyone from the Law Society to the retail that were speaking there, this is a growing problem. Is that not enough to tell you that the current laws are not doing enough to stop this? We need to try something different.
Can I ask you both, assuming you get through the stage of the police, what about prosecutions and sentencing? Do you have confidence in those? Have you got any examples where that's happened? Happy to, Robert first.
I mean, no. Again, because that they don't have the confidence to actually report it in the first instance, they don't feel they get support from their management in store first and foremost to go ahead and report it. The stores that I certainly deal with, when I get spoken to by a member and I raise it with the manager, the overriding fact always is that they were too busy, the store were too busy. Just deal with the customer, get the customer out as quickly as possible rather than report this. So I believe this will help, again, give the retail worker that confidence to say to their manager, no, I need to report this. This is now a crime. We all know that you can't assault people. We all know that you can't verbally abuse people, etc. For their ethnicity, if they're a girl, for instance, pregnant. But in retail, there is an acceptance, and certainly again from our members, that verbal abuse, not so much assault, verbal abuse is just part of your day-to-day job. So, and I'm a wee bit conscious that we keep mentioning age sales, the sales of alcohol, tobacco, etc. That's just one part of it. This happens all over stores, whether you're in the front selling alcohol or you're up the back just getting some goods for a customer. The problem is, in retail, we all know it's a volatile market just now. They're struggling to keep pace with each other. A lot of reduction in staff. It's leaving a lot of our members certainly have been left as lone workers in parts of the store. So it's not just to do with age-related goods. This is happening all over in Scotland, in stores. Doesn't matter where you're working. I don't know if that answers your question, Ms Bailiff.
It does, thank you.
Some employers, it's Usdor's opinion, that some employers are more reluctant to push for a prosecution than other employers. And certainly we would be thinking if this was in law, it would be more comfort to our members to know that there's a stronger law there and that it should be more enforceable.
That's great. Thank you both very much.
Mino, just like to come in on that.
Thanks, Convener. It's the comments you made, Mr Davey, about the Blantyre experience you had there. I think the situation you described, it sounds to me like those were criminal behaviours in any case. Do you think this bill is going to solve that problem? About if the police are failing to turn up to incidents like that?
I think, to go on what the previous panel was saying, it may just, because it becomes a priority, they may react to it as a priority. The problem that our members were facing in Blantyre was that the police knew who these individuals were that were doing this. They were well known for their behaviours, and it was young boys. So the police decided that we can let them do what they're doing, we'll go and pick them up later on. And that was the problem we were facing. They weren't going to the actual scene of the crime, where our members were being threatened. They were maybe picking them up later on in the local park, for instance.
But this bill will help overcome that issue, you think?
I mean, I don't know, but I think it would give... Again, it would give the retail workers... This is about giving the retail workers a bit more empowerment in their jobs, knowing they can go to a job that someone's got their back, for instance. At this moment in time, if any of you were to go into a store and ask a retail worker, do you believe the government supports you, the law protects you? I believe most of them would tell you no.
Okay.
I think that's very sad.
Okay, thank you.
Is that not an education issue as well in terms of training? Because, I mean, clearly there are laws there, but if they don't feel that those laws are there for their protection, is there a disconnect in their understanding of the laws that currently exist?
There's certainly training regarding the implementation of the laws and the consequences that our members would face if they don't adhere to the laws. And again, it's down to the reporting. I don't think a lot of employers encourage our members to report to the police verbal abuse. And I think we're having a stronger law and a campaign to advertise that law. It would be better for our members, and they would then feel more comfortable knowing that there's better protection in place, because at the moment they don't believe there is.
Is it a stronger law or just a law with a specific name over it? Are you saying that the current laws are not strong?
The current laws have not been enforced. It's our opinion the current laws are not being enforced. And again, for the previous panel, I mean, we're all joined up in this one. For the trade representatives that spoke before, from the co-op who does a lot of work with us in the UK, we're very joined up in this, and it's for the benefit of our members that we're supporting this, and we feel there's a need. If you look at the Usdaw surveys, it's as I mentioned, it's been going for a number of years. The UK survey is bad, but then when you take the Scottish element out of the UK survey, it's even worse. So there's a major problem up here, and it's growing, and I think other colleagues for previous panels have mentioned that they recognise that this problem's growing. And it's not just age sales, it's people coming in with alcohol, drunk, trying to buy more alcohol and they've been refused it, or trying to buy alcohol for minors and being refused it. So there's a lot of trigger points now, and it falls on the retail workers to police that. And if they don't, they get disciplined and potentially fined and taken to court.
Can I just come in a wee bit on that? You mentioned about would this law help it? I mean, these laws were already in place to protect the emergency services, the police, fire, ambulance, but another law was brought in, the Emergency Workers Act. I mean, I think it's reasonable to say that that has helped the police, fire, and NHS staff, etc., do their job. So while the laws were already there, just tightening it up and making it more specific has helped them do their job. So I believe bringing in something specific for retail workers will tighten up laws that are already there, give the workers in retail industry that bit of support and encouragement to further report these crimes, and also just, yeah, I believe it would help, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Alison Harris, please. Nothing? Okay. Colin Beattie?
Convener, I'd like to come back to something Stuart Forrest said there. You said about the current laws not being enforced. If we bring in new laws, more laws, are they going to be enforced?
Well, again, we would hope so. We would hope if there's, I think it was mentioned in another panel, if there's a stronger law there, there's more chance of the police going to come to attend and to enforce it. Because just now, our members are telling us that they don't feel that the issues happening in retail are not being taken serious. And our members have got to live with that. I mean, as I mentioned, they live in the community. We don't want them to be scared or afraid to go into their work, but potentially that they have to work there for various reasons. Living in the community, it could be childcare, it could be whatever. They can't just move stores because they've had a bad experience. So they go in every day in that, so they need to know that there's a strong law in place to protect them.
If current laws were enforced, were properly enforced, would that do the job?
I couldn't answer that because they're not being enforced.
Okay. Just touching on something Robert Davey was talking about. You were talking about the fact that there'd been a bit of focus on age-related issues, and certainly the previous panel couldn't come up with any examples when I asked them about alternative scenarios. Just to explain, I'm particularly thinking about obstruction and hindrance here. Would you be able to give me an example that is not dealing with an age-related product, which to me is a different scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I'm unaware if maybe the panel may have seen this video. It went viral. It was in Tory Glen, where a worker was asked, given an instruction by their management, to place reduced items on the shelf. So stuff that's going to run out of date, put out the shelf for just to get it sold that day a bit cheaper. And there was a crowd of people, customers, already there waiting. Now, when this colleague, our member, went down to put these stuff out, he never got as close to the shelf. He was basically set upon like a pack of wolves, and that our member received an injury in his line of work. So would that not be classed as hindrance? He went to do a job. People wouldn't wait 5 minutes to let him put stuff on a shelf where he didn't get near the shelf. The video's there. I believe another colleague filmed it because it was so vicious, the way to get a 10p lettuce, chicken, whatever it may have been. But our member received an injury that day in the line of his work. Also, I think the big part is, and I believe the previous panel touched on it, was just if someone refuses to leave the store, what are our members supposed to do? They'll call the police won't turn up. Are we just supposed to stand there all day? That is hindrance. You can't just stand there. You have a job to do. Do you believe it would be a manager would accept that you were just going to stand there with this abusive customer all day because they refused to leave the store? There is policies in place that if a customer gets abusive or violent towards one of our members, they're supposed to remove themselves from the situation. That's not always possible because this abusive person will physically stop them.
Let me just continue with this obstruction and hindrance, because there's a bit of a concern about if it's young people, for example, who are maybe being abusive, and are we going to criminalise them by prosecuting them for hindrance and obstruction? I've had 1 or 2 examples of hindrance and obstruction, but I haven't really understood where the limits of that would be. What would be considered hindrance and obstruction? You've given an example of an extreme case, but what would the lesser cases be that would trigger criminality? Because obviously I'm concerned about young people being unnecessarily criminalised at an early age, which affects their entire future.
I think in the convenience sector, you sometimes have groups of youths standing outside stores, and that can be viewed as hindrance, where they're annoying the retail staff. They're coming in and out, coming in. They're going in, causing abuse in the stores, then going back out. We've had members followed home for they've been trying to put some people out the store, who've been followed home and they've been abused. So that's bound to be a hindrance rather than age-related. And there need to be, there has to be some law in place to support that. And this current law is not working. And whilst I agree, it's youngsters, you maybe don't want to see with a criminal record, but what else is there for them to do?
So you believe that, you know, if this law came in, it should be vigorously applied against young people causing problems in the shops?
Well, if it was, they were causing problem with the police, would the law be vigorously pursued? Sure it would.
I mean, I don't think any of us are sitting here, we want to criminalise every young person in Scotland. I mean, we were all young at one point, a long time ago for myself, but we were all young. But this is about sending a message that this is people who are going to their jobs. It was mentioned, I believe, in the first panel, low-paid jobs, predominantly female, who deserve protection at their work. Now, whether it's young, middle-aged or old, if someone goes into a store with that deliberate intention of abusing a shop worker, then yes, they should be criminalised. I'm sorry, and I'll stand by that. If someone's willing to learn from those actions and see the error, if that makes them see the error of their ways to stop that from happening again, then that's a good thing. I mean, we go about carrying for the rest of their lives. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. It doesn't really work like that. You get spent records, etc. So I think we need to be careful. But we do need to protect people in the line of work. And I think if we bring in a specific law protecting retail workers, one, it may encourage the employers, because I believe there needs to be there needs to be more importance put on the employers to protect their workers, their duty of care, by putting a poster up at the front of the store that any of these actions, you will be prosecuted. It may make people think twice. It certainly worked on British Transport when you see it on the trains, etc., that abuse of our staff will not be tolerated. A simple poster like that, which at this moment in time you won't see in many stores, may put people off from being abusive.
To Andy Whiteman, because I think you pick up on some of those issues.
Thanks, yes. I mean, just on that last point, I mean, that could be done just now because assault is a crime, abuse is a crime, threatening behaviour is a crime. You mentioned, Mr Forrest, the question of someone not leaving the store and that being a hindrance. I mean, you'd still rely, if that were the law, you'd still rely on the police turning up, which you're saying they're not.
Well, in the first instance, it would be the retail worker that would try and get the person to leave the store.
Sure, by saying
and in the extreme, you would maybe end up having to get the police, but
yeah,
a lot of times people will leave reluctantly after abusing their members before it becomes a police matter.
You said earlier on, you said that since 2015 there'd been an increase in, I can't remember exactly what the increase was, but looking at the USDOR's survey that you've got, there was an increase, yes, after 2015, but that followed a decline. So there was a spike in verbal abuse for, in 2017. There was also a graph showing physical violence, again, that had declined quite a low level, 2015. It was down again in 2016, but the spike was in 2017. What's the sort of cause of that spike in 2015-16 to sort of pre-2015-16 levels? Are you attributing it to anything particular?
Well, I mean, the austerity comes into a part of everything. We've seen a lot of people having more difficult times. We see the retail market staff shrinking in the stores, etc., where maybe the opportunity for theft, etc., becomes more easy. It seems to be a sign of the times, and as I mentioned, particularly in Scotland, the survey's telling us that it's getting worse. I think 6 in 10 retail workers from our survey suffer verbal abuse on an almost daily basis.
Okay, now I just wondered if you were alluding to any particular piece of legislation or anything. It was no. Okay, thanks. Returning to a question I asked the previous panel, the section in the bill on aggravated offences in relation to age-related products, of course that aggravated offence would only apply if any of the offences in section 1 were to become law. Given the quite strong evidence we've heard about the public duty that retail workers are fulfilling in upholding these age-related restrictions and the penalties that they face, do you not believe that this aggravated offence should be available for any crime that's being prosecuted, regardless of whether it's a Section 1 offence here? Because it's up to the prosecution authorities ultimately to decide whether to prosecute under the common law, a breach of the peace. They can choose which they think is the best chance of success in the courts. And if they're not prosecuting a Section 1 offence, you can't have the aggravated.
Well, again, we would welcome if the bill was to be extended to other groups, but we certainly believe that Mr. Johnston's bill should be taken in the way it has been put before the committee.
Okay, and just to be clear, we have rehearsed this, but you're saying that the police and the prosecution authorities are not doing enough at the moment to protect retail workers, and don't doubt that's the case, and also don't doubt the evidence that you've brought about the level of abuse and that something needs to be done. The question for this committee, of course, is this bill the right way to do it? So is it your view that this bill is mainly, not exclusively, but mainly about sending a very clear message that reassures retail workers?
I think to be absolutely clear, it's not me that's saying it's not working, it's our members.
Yes,
it's
sure.
the people that are actually facing this level of abuse every day of their working lives that are saying it's not working. So I think we can only take their word for it. They're in the firing line and they're telling me as their trade union representative that they feel no protection in their work, either from their employer or from the people who are actually meant to uphold the law, as in the police and the courts.
But you would agree, would you not, that if this bill were to pass, let's say as it stands at the moment, it would be deemed pretty ineffective if the police and the prosecuting authorities
If they don't act on it, yeah.
enforce it? So
if they don't enforce it, but that would be the same with any law, would it not?
Sure, absolutely. No, that's what I'm suggesting, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Alison Harris, do you want to come back in at this point?
No, I've heard quite a lot of evidence.
Okay, then I'll move to Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. I want to ask similar questions to ask the last panel. So, this bill, we've talked about the cultural change that we need to send this message across to protect workers. We've heard about the number of workers that this bill could protect, and thanks to the evidence you guys have given, we understand to an extent the problem that exists. But what other action, because this bill isn't a panacea for all of the ills that retail workers face and people in pub and clubs. But so what other action would you like to see take place in order to protect retail workers that this bill doesn't cover?
I think I would like to see a greater duty placed on the employers.
Right.
I don't think that happens just now. And I mean, I can give you a really good example where I had a member who was assaulted, and this was an escalation. It started as verbal abuse up to physical abuse. We took it through the company's procedures to try and get this customer banned, and it went all the way to a senior director of that company, and the end result was they would not ban this customer. Their answer to our member was, if this customer enters the store, leave the floor. Now there's 75 other workers in that store. Are they all meant to leave the floor, or is it just that specific member? So I believe this bill would place a greater emphasis on the employer, but I think we need to see a greater duty of care, just so that the employer, at the end of the day, there is a duty of care, there's health and safety, etc. But due to the cuts in the retail sector that's happening all over, we see it, I believe that emphasis is lessening every day.
Right. We also heard from the store owners and the retail sector representatives that they're spending on average £8,000 per store, I think was the number that was given, to try and protect workers. Do you think enough's being done by the employers, and what other issues would you like to see taken apart from the example you've just given?
I mean, sorry, just a quickly one. I mean, they do mention guards in the stores. There's numerous examples of the guards being removed from that role to go and stack shelves simply because there's not enough staff. So I accept that they're spending a lot of money on CCTV, etc. But the roles of the guards, which do play a pivotal role, and I'm not saying they're not there to prevent. That's not their role, but they're there to, as a deterrent. Someone walks in, sees a guard, it may make them think twice. But when that guard's not on the podium at the front of the store because they're up having to put bread away or tins of beans away, it makes it a wee bit easier. Stuart mentioned earlier, Mr Forrest mentioned earlier, that the shoplifting is becoming very easier in stores. It certainly is because of the lack of staff.
Okay, Mr Forrest, you want to come in on that?
Certainly the security has been cut back with the cutbacks that we've seen in the stores, and whilst one of the previous panel mentioned there's a greater emphasis on CCTV and some verbal communications, but the deterrent has been the store security guard, and we're seeing them they're moved about at certain times, or we're seeing them taken away altogether. But it's not just the employer. I mean, us again back to the Freedom from Fear campaign and the Respect from Shop Workers campaign, where it's the public has got to be educated as well. And we do that. We go out to the public, we go out to the supermarkets, large stores, small stores, and try and educate the public by saying, look, the people working in here are not there to be abused. And one of our good strap lines is we do it every November, is we go out and we say, keep your cool at Christmas. Because again, Flashpoint, people go in to stores, they're busier. I take you back to 2-3 years ago in Dundee, where a large retailer had to close a store because of people fighting over the stuff on Black Friday. Our members are in that melee, getting injured, getting abused because they're doing their job. And so there's an education to the public as well. But a message to the public has got to come through Mr Johnston's bill, and that is to say, look, you will be treated seriously. And we've got to get the police and the Crown Office to treat abuse of shop workers seriously.
Okay, thanks so much.
I mean, from what you've said so far, the gaps here do seem to be around prosecution, of attendance when there's an incident, and prosecution. And you've talked quite a bit about employers' responsibilities here and what they need to do. Now, I'm taking a wild guess here that the people who enact this kind of abuse on shop workers are not people who are going to be paying much heed to new laws that are passed or what the laws say. So the messaging to them, how do you think the messaging of a new bill is going to get to the people who actually commit these offences in the first place? How is it going to make a difference to them? Or do we need some actual high-profile prosecutions in order to get the message out? Isn't that really the disconnect here?
Well, education's a disconnect in terms of how people behave when they're dealing with retail workers, but it might take some high-profile prosecutions, in your word, to get the message home. But again, it's the police are an issue. They don't take it. I mean, they've had cuts as well, and they don't take it as seriously as some other offences. But if it's a stronger piece of legislation that people are breaking the law, they may do.
I think certainly from my perspective, listening to the evidence today, Gillian Maudsley said in the first session that it was about understanding where the gaps are that need to be filled in order to prevent this problem that is clearly there. I don't think anybody's disputing that there is an issue around this. But the evidence in the first session said the laws are there, and nobody seems to have disputed that. The law is there. You're using the term stronger law, but when I asked the direct question, is it stronger law? You said no. But then the issue that we mainly seem to have heard about is around response times from the police or attendance at all, and an understanding from shop workers themselves of their rights not to be abused, and of the offenders who actually are doing it for whatever reason and don't much care what the law is anyway, because the law is there to prevent them doing it already. So what I'm trying to understand here is how you feel this bill will change those factors. What is the actual gap that this bill will fill that isn't currently there?
I think, just to touch on your point, that if someone goes into a store with the intention to abuse or physically assault a shop worker, then no, I don't think any law that you could produce here would stop that. That's someone for a mindset. You just will not stop that. However, if there's a specific law that targets ones that believe the customer is always right, so I think we've all heard that phrase, customer's always right, that it's their right to abuse a shop worker. It may make them think twice. It may stop them. I don't think we can set out. I don't think there's a quick answer to this or a quick fix. We're never ever going to get it down to zero, as much as we all want that, where everybody goes to their work. Absolutely no chance of being assaulted, verbally abused, etc. That is not going to happen. Let's be realistic. But to put in something where a greater emphasis, where it's a specific law for retail workers, to give them the empowerment, the confidence that they are being protected, that the lawmakers and those who are employed to uphold the law, the police, are going to give them a greater deal of protection should they face this type of abuse. I think this is where it's more important, because yes, the law is there. We all know the law is there. You can't assault people. You can't. We all know how. Most people would, I would say, would know how to behave. That doesn't mean to say that there's this wee part who believe it's acceptable because it's only a shop worker. And I think that's what's happening here. And this is where we now have a case, certainly my members, who believe it's part of their job to be abused. So I think this law would change that mindset and give people just a greater bit of confidence to take it forward and reporting it.
And should this, I mean, in doing a law like this, are you saying that shop workers are different to, say, other workers who also deal with the public? Or should there be a law for every element of workers who deal with the public to protect them from the public? I
would welcome anyone getting protected at their work. But bear in mind, we already have a law protecting police workers, fire, etc. Are we saying that they're a higher class of worker than a retail worker? So I think we need to be very careful, because a worker, in my eyes, is a worker. Someone out trying to earn a living to provide for a family. In my opinion, you should return home from your work in exactly the same condition that you went to your work. Maybe a little more tired, but it should be the same condition.
And should we not therefore be ensuring that the laws we already have are enacted for all workers, rather than creating new layers of law for each specification of worker?
Sometimes you need to create a new layer to make sure that the previous laws that are there will be enacted upon. For example, emergency workers.
Which is another layer of law.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Mr Johnson, do you want to add anything at the end?
Yes, just very briefly, just following on from both Colin Beattie's and indeed the convener's questioning around the types of person, I think that there's perhaps the impression that the people who fail to comply with the requirements around age-restricted selling, either because they themselves may be underage or they may be with someone underage, there seems to be a characterisation that the people who cause issues are either typically underage or typically people who might not comply with law. Do you think there is a typical person who causes difficulty to shop workers, indeed abuse, or actually can it be...
It can be across the board many times, and there's, I think one of the colleagues mentioned there's about 200 plus age-restricted products in stores now, and they've got to be challenged and people are buying them, so I think it goes across the board.
No, I think it does go across the board, and the example I used about the escalation, that was a 62-year-old woman that was doing that abuse, the shop worker. I don't think you would normally associate a 62-year-old woman with that level of abuse, so I don't think it's specifically young people, don't think it's old people, I think it's broad spectrum.
And just finally, on the point about the customer always being right, quote, unquote, I'm just wondering if you'd reflect on the sort of behaviours that might typically be found in the store, of terms of customers simply not moving away from the counter, allowing further people behind the queue because the retail worker has not done what they've asked, whether that's the sale of an age-restricted item or simply go and check the stock room. Is that something that people are encountering, and can that lead to escalation of that behaviour?
Certainly, it's more common with the sale of age-related alcohol, tobacco, etc. That if our members refuse to serve them, that they won't move. Our member will then call for their manager, who'll come down and, well, in my experience, sometimes will override our members' original decision and just serve them to get rid of them. That seems to be the only way to remove the people from the store, is to actually serve them. But it's not just exclusively for age-related. I had an incident in a store where the self-service, which again is becoming a large part of retail, we're doing away with checkouts, Most people self-service, and I'm pretty sure if you've used one, I haven't, but you always get a problem in the baggage area. Now, there's only usually one member of staff to deal with 14, 16 self-service. They don't get there quick enough. That customer can then, for want of a better phrase, throw a strop. We had an incident where a customer threatened to slash the throat of our member, and the manager's way of dealing with that was to take them to another till to serve them instead of just removing them from the store. So it's quite common, just standing there and refusing to move.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we're going to close now unless anybody's got any other questions that they want to add in the light of that evidence. No? So can I thank you, gentlemen, very much for coming and giving evidence to us. If there's anything else you want to add, please feel free to write to us and let us know. Now, we're going to move the committee into private now, so we'll have a quick suspension while we do that.